Nigeria lost over 8.7 trillion naira at 758 naira to a dollar between January and August. This is according to reports which attributed to the country's inability to meet its quota allocated by the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Nigeria, Africa's biggest crude producer, failed to drill 144 million barrels of crude oil within the period under review compared to the quota of 1.8 million barrels per day allocated to it by OPEC that should have amounted to 432 million barrels per day but resulted into just 1.2 million barrels per day. That's about 288 million barrels between January and August, amounting to just 17.5 trillion naira in earnings at an average of $80 per barrel. Now, the root causes have always been crude oil theft and pipeline vandalism in the Niger Delta and major production areas. So this is despite 48 billion naira security contract that was being awarded by government. With the activities of oil thieves and pipeline vandals severely impacting production, the economy and the rising cost of living, why has it been hard for government to curb the menace? Big question. Joining me this morning to discuss this, I have Chukwuemeka Osuji, partner Olaniwun Ajayi LP. He joins me from Surrey, England. Thank you so much, Chukwuemeka, for talking to us.
Thank you very much. Good morning.
Nigeria's quota allocation has been decelerating for years now. In a conservative crude oil price of $85 per barrel, revenue loss to Nigeria in 1 month is now over $1 billion. And the major issues are that the government has not been able to squarely tackle the issues of oil bunkering, theft, pipeline vandalism. I'd like you to just take us through or tell us what are the things that we don't know about these attending issues in Nigeria's petroleum industry.
Well, thank you very much. I think first and foremost, most of the facts I think are out there in the public space. And if maybe we step back a little bit and look at what's happened over the last 2 to 3 years, if you recall, as of 3 years ago, 2 years ago, we were in a very poor shape in a manner of speaking. And at some point, mid 2022, I think, or first quarter of 2022, our production levels had gone as low as 900,000 barrels per day, right? It was at that time that the government had then put in place certain mechanisms, including executing these security contracts to then try to curb the vandalism and then at the same time ramp up volumes. So from 900,000 barrels in 2022, I think mid-2022, we then cropped up. And then by February this year, I think we had gotten up to about 1,300 barrels per day. And then gradually by the third quarter, we then came down gradually to 1.2 barrels. I think that's what we're doing at the moment. So if you look at the pattern, we had gotten down to the doldrums, then we ramped up a bit to about 1.3 I mentioned, and then we're now to 1.2. So that shows you that the vandalism, even though it continued, had been reduced at least significantly for us to get up from 900,000 to 1.3 and then 1.2, but it's still there. Is still there, and that vandalism is one of the major causes, but not the sole cause. Of course, oil production, even though it occurs cyclically, there are periods where the oil producers, for example, need to go into what is known around as maintenance, either scheduled maintenance or exceptional maintenance. Whatever be the case, during this period, the production volumes might reduce for a bit and then ramp up a bit. So it's within this entire matrix of facts that we didn't have our numbers. Like I mentioned, we've come up a bit, but personally speaking, we are not nearly where we should be. And the question of vandalism continues to be a typical issue, even though, as I mentioned when I started, it's been reduced to some extent.
Let's now look at how it affects OPEC, because, of course, the 13-member OPEC group distributes oil production quotas based on market conditions. So how does this affect OPEC in terms of global market demands? And how do you think it is evaluating the situation, knowing fully well that this is a major contributor to oil being produced and being demanded for within the global market space? So how do you think it is reacting to it to ensure that it has enough stock for global demands?
Well, based on the quota we were given, we were given an average of, I think, about 1.8 million barrels to produce, Nigeria specifically speaking. And of course, we then have that shortfall of about 600,000. From an OPEC point of view, speaking frankly, given the trends we've seen in oil prices, there's been a couple of fluctuations over the last couple of months, but pretty much oil prices have not been doing too badly at all. it's actually in OPEC's interest to curb production levels. So what OPEC pretty much tries to do is when it looks at the prices on the market, it then determines when it deems it best to speak to the producing countries to reduce their production quotas. Because if they reduce the production quotas and there's less supply in the market, then naturally the prices will then react to the fluctuations, to the volumes in the market. So from an OPEC point of view, it's not really such a bad thing, so to speak, to the extent to which OPEC can then begin to see that, of course, we are producing less volumes than we should. So that means there's less supply. And that might, depending on what other countries are doing, have an implication for the pricing of the product in the market. So I'm not sure OPEC will take a deep view of the fact that we're underproducing. What OPEC might do might just be to continue to give us that allowance to encourage us to continue to ramp up to the thresholds we've been given.
So talking about other countries, most especially African countries now that may have the capacity to scale up production, which countries are you looking at? Because there have been questions as regards if Nigeria cannot meet up with the 1.8 million barrels per day requested by OPEC and is producing about 1.2 million, which is not that bad anyway. There might be other African countries that might take the #1 spot. Are there any?
Well, countries like Angola, for example, historically have been doing very well, and we think they will continue to do well. There are a few other African countries whose volumes are not as much as Nigeria, but I think Angola will pretty much be one of the stars that we're looking at from Africa to continue to turn out those volumes there.
While the reduction may amount to quantity shock, the expected increase in the price of crude arising from the controlled global output may result in some extra earnings for the NNPCL. So do you think that will happen in terms of revenue accruals?
Oh, yes. To the extent to which the prices keep increasing, that's additional earnings for the country. You recall a few months ago, whilst the subsidy was still in place, those earnings didn't really translate to a lot for the country because even though we were getting additional revenue from increased prices of crude, at the same time, because of how much government was spending on subsidies for refined products, which of course it's impacted by the price of the crude, we were losing money on that end. But to the extent to which government has now more or less reduced, if not totally taken out payments and subsidies, then that means that additional inflow can really be turned to be additional inflow for the country. So yes, it's a good thing for us if the prices continue on the bullish trend we've seen over the last couple of weeks.
Just as you said earlier, in the second half of last year, just before production fell to about 900,000 barrels per day, the government came out to say that it is in collaboration with some local security groups, and they said at that time they took steps to curb the menace. So in your own opinion, would you, or your own assessment, would you say that the government has done well or done enough, or there are other deep-rooted issues that you think that the government need to look at, or some other approach to deal with the issue of attacks on its facilities?
Well, I think in terms of assessment, scorecard, well, I would say the government hasn't done too badly. Security, if you speak to people who are experts in security matters, I'm not one of them, but from what we know, security really, the best approach for security is local. The people who are most proximate to the sites of these impacts are the people who are better placed to know who is doing these things and best placed to address them. But at the same time, we understand that the vandalization that was going on and the crude theft was at such a scale that it was difficult to say it was just the locals that were doing these things. Clearly, there were people with more clout, with more international connections that were involved in these activities. And people had begun to call on not just the government, but even on the security agencies to step up to curb these things. But I think one thing that can be improved on is what I call technology. I think the increasing use of technology could be a fantastic way to reduce this, both in terms of making sure all upstream oil installations are well metered. They all have the LACT units and then all the equipment to make sure that at every time there is a pressure reduction, which would naturally happen when there's a breach of a pipeline, it can be spotted. We also need to have more aerial and amphibious vessels. And amphibious vessels, I mean the vessels that can go both on land and on swampy, shallow waters, that can then help the security agencies and the people that are monitoring to be able to assess some of these very inaccessible areas, which, as you understand, is largely the areas where these vandalisms are going on. So I think if the government spends a bit more or is a bit more deliberate in the use of technology to detect and to curb these things, I think it will go a long way to reducing what's going on in addition to the measures they already have in place.
But then according to the government expending resources, most especially finance, towards dealing with this vandalism and attacks, of course, the Nigerian National Security Advisor, that is Nuhu Ribadu, came out to say that Nigeria expended 48 billion naira, spent 48 billion naira annually, all right, to deal with international thieves and, of course, these vandals. But then 400,000 barrels are still being lost on a daily, all right, in terms of oil production. So there have been talks coming from different quarters that the security contract issued to an ex-militant, without having to mention his name, that contract should be revoked or stopped. So now that you're saying that the country or the Nigerian government should invest in technology to deal with these issues, would you also be inclined in that manner that, okay, if this person is not giving the federal government what it wants and funds are still being expended towards that cause, then there should be a review of contracts?
Well, one thing I will say is I would imagine that these contracts will be performance-based contracts. I would not imagine that the government would take huge sums of money. Yes, it's possible that when the contracts are signed, there's a contract value. Say it's a 5-year contract with a yearly value, and then that yearly value times 5, you can then have a lump sum to say this is X billion naira contract. But I would imagine that within the 5 years, there will be performance milestones. Yes, there might be base fees, but at the same time, there will be performance milestones. So I would imagine that the government would expect that those performance milestones are met. So the payments that should go to the persons who've been awarded these contracts, one would imagine should be something that reflects the performance milestones. So to the extent to which they are underperforming, then one would think that the payments on the back of the contracts should again track those milestones. So even though the contract might be said to be, say, a $100 contract, one would not imagine that the $100 is paid every year to the contractors, irrespective of whether they perform or not. So the point still remains, that is just the contract value. But in terms of actuals paid, I would imagine that it will be performance-based. So where they are underperforming or not performing optimally, then I would imagine that the payments made to the contractors will be reviewed. But even in terms from a performance point of view, I would also expect that the government will periodically review the contracts, again, to check whether the objectives of the contract is being met and the extent to which those objectives are being met. And if the government takes the view that the contractors are not performing optimally, then the government reserves the right to either review the contracts, review performance, scale down, or maybe cancel them totally. But again, because these are security matters, one always has to be a bit careful how you speak to them, because it's the people who really are the forefront, who have all the facts at the fingertips, are best placed to assess, and then make a recommendation to the government on what to do.
Well, there are other questions as regards the Niger Delta Commission too, but then we might just not be able to talk about that because there have been questions maybe whether it should be scrapped. It was actually initiated to train and to equip the youths in that region to see how they can also continue and collaborate in the protection of the facilities in the Niger Delta region, but then we have not seen any concrete step towards the direction. Maybe some other time we'll talk about it, but then Chukwuemeka Osuji, our partner, Olaniwun Ajayi LP, it's nice to have had this conversation with you.
Thank you very much. Do have a nice day.
And you too.